Hugh O'Neill was born about 1550 in the O'Neiland part of North Armagh, possibly in one of those crannogs in the area like Marlaco or one of those crannogs. And he was brought up there until the late 1550s when his father Matthew was killed, and thereafter he became a ward of the Crown and was moved into the care of the Hovenden family at Balgriffin, just north of Dublin. There were big rivalries between the O'Neills. There was, and this had been caused by Con O'Neill becoming Earl of Tyrone. Con O'Neill had favoured an adopted son, Matthew, and they became known as the McBarons. That was Hugh O'Neill's section of the family. And they were based, as I say, in North Armagh. Then there was Shane O'Neill, Con's eldest son, and his offspring. They were based around Benburb in Tyrone. And then there was the other branch of the family, another rival group in West Tyrone around Strabane, and that is Turloughlin and his line. So there were big rivalries in the O'Neill family, which the Crown in Dublin, the English Crown in Dublin, sought to exploit all the time to divide this really powerful family. This is one of the most interesting aspects of Hugh O'Neill, in that one of his first major biographers in the 20th century, Sean O'Whelan, reckoned that Hugh O'Neill had been moved to England to be brought up, but in effect he stayed in the outskirts of Dublin. He really becomes important after 1562 when his elder brother Brian, who is obviously first in line, when he is killed by Turloughlin. So it's only at that point, after 1562, that the spotlight falls on Hugh. After that, he becomes pivotal in a major bargaining chip in the Crown's relations with Shane O'Neill, who is the dominant O'Neill at this point after civil wars within the Tyrone lordship. And it's when the war against Shane O'Neill hots up in 1565 and 1566 that Hugh O'Neill really becomes important to the Crown. When Shane O'Neill is killed in 1567, it is Turloughlin who succeeds to the O'Neill lordship. He is inaugurated as O'Neill at Tullahogue, the famous inaugural stone, after Shane is assassinated by the MacDonalds. So Hugh O'Neill is even more important after Turloughlin's succession because he has got a legitimate claim to the earldom of Tyrone. And so at that point, Lord Deputy Sidney brings Hugh O'Neill back north and installs him in O'Neiland in Armagh. Now at that point, the state starts to say that Hugh O'Neill, because they're paying him and assisting him, that he is really the Queen's O'Neill. He's a pawn in their hands. But in fact, it's all his relationships in the O'Neill land territory, in Armagh and across Tyrone that makes the difference, because his half-brother Art McBarron O'Neill and his younger brother Cormac McBarron O'Neill are already established in O'Neiland. So in fact, like, he is going back there, but he's got relatives there who are important connections to his political authority in that region. After that, at the start of the 1570s, Hugh O'Neill is making big strides against Turloughlin. But then in the early 1570s, the Earl of Essex arrives with a colonial expedition to Ulster. And he destabilises Ulster, and Ulster unites under Turloughlin O'Neill. So in effect, Hugh O'Neill's gallop to power, as it were, is somewhat slackened at that point, and he has to sort of regroup after that. Definitely all of Hugh O'Neill's marriages were political. Like, marriage at this point is really to achieve political ends. Your love life really doesn't come into marriage. Marriage is to make allies and to make children who you will marry off and make further allies with. That's what marriage is all about. So it's nothing to do with a love or affection. It's to do with politics. So he, first of all, is married to the daughter Brian McPhelim O'Neill of Clandyboy. And that is a very good idea of a marriage, because in the Belfast region, as you would call it now, like that's an important area to have a political connection with. But when the Earl of Essex comes to Ulster in his so-called enterprise of Ulster and targets Brian McPhelim in particular, Brian McPhelim is no use to Hugh O'Neill anymore, and O'Neill, as an ally of the Crown, feels the need to obviously stay connected to Essex, who gives him various baubles like new clothes and military support. That in that situation, Hugh O'Neill divorces Brian McPhelim's daughter. At that point, then, he makes a much more, even better marriage alliance, in fact. He makes a marriage alliance with the O'Donnells in Tyrconnell, what is now County Donegal. And this is a strategic marriage alliance against Turlough Linnock, who is based at Strabane. So, and this cuts across the general divisions of Ulster politics, because the O'Neills and O'Donnells generally faced off against each other. Now, O'Neill is making an ally with the ruling group of the O'Donnells. And so he marries Siobhan O'Donnell, he has male heirs from her connection, and that's also important. So he has 2 male heirs from Siobhan O'Donnell. And that is the key building block of all his power in Ulster, his connection with the O'Donnells, because in turn, one of his daughters, presumably from his first marriage or from some earlier liaison, marries in turn Red Hugh O'Donnell, his brother-in-law, I suppose, to connect up both families even further. Then, most famously, there is his marriage with Mabel Bagnall. That really is an attempt to neutralise the Bagnall family. The Bagnalls are a colonial interlopers in Newry. They're established there in old monastic property. They have got ambitions in Ulster. They want Nicholas and then his son Henry want to become provincial governors of Ulster. And Hugh O'Neill knows that. And really he is trying to buy off the Bagnalls by winning over and eloping with Mabel Bagnall, in the hope that he can draw the Bagnalls into an alliance, just as the way he's done with the O'Donnells. But in fact, it goes badly wrong, because in fact it aggravates the Bagnall. And Bagnall says, you know, I have mixed my family's blood with these barbarous Irish, so not a good idea. So consequently, that marriage, and obviously O'Neill has got great charm. This is the thing about him, like he's always described as having great charisma, and obviously it worked with younger women in the case of Mabel Bagnall, or indeed it worked obviously with soldiers and people he wanted to win over. He had great charm. So he marries her also in Dublin, and he elopes with her, but that marriage only lasts a couple of years and she dies. After that, also probably to keep the Bagnalls boxed in, he marries Catherine McGuinness. Like the McGuinness family are a hugely important family in South Down. So consequently, once again, that is a political marriage to keep those borders controlled and to keep the pressure on the Bagnalls. So married, and that also moved the McGuinnesses out of the Bagnall sphere of influence into O'Neill's sphere of influence. So all of these marriages are political, and really they're nothing to do with love. Obviously they're to do with sex in the sense of procreation of children, but that's about it. So after the Essex's enterprise of Ulster in the early 1570s, the English Crown in Ireland had come to depend on Hugh O'Neill to defend the borders of Ulster between basically the northern reaches of Dublin into Ulster. And so he became vital in that regard, but they also quickly recognised his great ambition. By 1580, they were saying that he is going to be the greatest subject in Ulster, and he's going to control the province between Donegal and Dundalk, basically. That's what they're saying. And this becomes apparent, particularly in an incident in 1583, when Turlough, the ruling O'Neill, is declared dead. And at that point, Hugh O'Neill and other aspirants to the title, they rushed to the inaugural stone at Tullahoe. And this shows that Hugh O'Neill, not only does he want to be Earl of Tyrone, but he wants to have the Gaelic title, the banned Gaelic title of the O'Neill. So he is ready to be inaugurated by the rest of the O'Neill clan. And then news comes that Turlough has recovered from a 24-hour drunken-induced coma. So, but that shows how ambitious Hugh O'Neill is. After that, in 1584, he finally gains control over what is central Tyrone at this point, which is now eastern Tyrone, the bit around Dungannon. He finally wins control of that area. He wrests that from Turlough's control. The government recognises control of that, and then a couple of years, they then recognise him in Parliament in Dublin as the Earl of Tyrone, and then in 1587 he goes to court in London, and the Queen recognises him as the Earl of Tyrone and gives him a patent to the Earldom of Tyrone. And at that point, the Queen Elizabeth finds Hugh O'Neill very charming and thinks he's the greatest. You know, he will do the job in pacifying Ulster for him. But the problem is that the English officials in Dublin don't see it that way. They realise that he is going to be too powerful in their eyes, particularly because he has this connection with the O'Donnells in Tyrconnell, what is now Donegal. And because of that, after Hugh O'Neill comes back from court in London, the state in Dublin actually shifts its position and starts to support Turlough. So in a case O'Neill becomes too powerful. But not only do they do that, but famously they send a ship round to Donegal. Red Hugh O'Donnell, his prospective son-in-law, is lured on board to drink, and they batten down the hatches, and Red Hugh O'Donnell is brought back to Dublin as a captive. Also, they try to move the famous Ureta or sub-kings, MacMahon, O'Hanlon, and others. They try and bring them back into the government camp to try and basically start to control Hugh O'Neill. And also, the money they'd been paying Hugh O'Neill, they start paying to Turlough as a subsidy. So consequently, at that point, just before the Armada arrives, when indeed Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, is held to be a bit suspect, and it might, if the Spaniards do land in force, he might have acted differently. So at that point, the state is beginning to worry about his loyalty. But that is basically because they have stopped supporting him. So then there's a big effort to try and get Red Hugh O'Donnell out of jail. And eventually, after nearly 4 years in jail, he sprung from Dublin Castle with Hugh O'Neill's assistance. That escape is essentially organised by Hugh O'Neill. But in the interim, the government's policy in Ulster has developed significantly, in particularly what is called the Monaghan settlement. This is a way of actually anglicising a Gaelic lordship. What they'd done here is they'd accused the ruling McMahon, Hugh Roe McMahon, of taking Gaelic exactions, even though he was a patentee of the crown. And as a result, they have him executed in his own country of Monaghan and in Monaghan town. And this frightens all the Gaelic lords of Ulster, that this could be done. And after that, the territory of the McMahons is turned into the county of Monaghan. It's given a sheriff. Church lands are taken over. And one of the major beneficiaries of this is Hugh O'Neill's old rival, Henry Bagnall. So consequently, and that is one of the reasons for the Mabel overtures to try and win Mabel over, and in turn Henry Bagnall, which of course doesn't work. But Henry Bagnall, after the settlement of Monaghan, sees the way to becoming Lord President of Ulster, because all these, the so-called shiring of Ulster, turning it into counties, will give him a revenue and give him a purpose. But so that is the policy, to promote the smaller freeholders and smaller branches of a clan against their lord, and to turn it into an English county. And that is the policy. And that is one of the major reasons why the war actually starts. And the war, from the Gaelic lord's point of view, is a necessity. Fermanagh is the next domino to fall in Ulster, or the next domino as regards crown policy to follow after the reform of Monaghan. Basically, they have similar intentions with the lordship of Fermanagh ruled by the Maguires as they had with the Monaghan area ruled by the McMahons. But a much bigger issue is at stake, because the Maguires are an even more important family than the McMahons. Once again, one of the principal Ureta or subject kings of Ulster. So there's no way that Hugh O'Neill, or indeed O'Donnell, who sometimes competed for control of Fermanagh, are going to let Fermanagh fall into English hands. In 1593, a sheriff is sent in to Fermanagh to take control of it for the English, but he is repulsed by Hugh O'Neill's brother, Cormac MacBaron O'Neill. And then, when that happens, the Crown declares war on Hugh Maguire. Now, Hugh Maguire is Hugh O'Neill's cousin, and also because of the marriage alliances he's now unfurling with his children, he's his new son-in-law. So once again, there's no reason in the world that Hugh O'Neill is going to abandon Hugh Maguire. So a sort of phony war fought by proxies proceeds in Fermanagh. In the first instance, Hugh O'Neill fights ostensibly with Henry Bagnall, because the Crown expects Hugh O'Neill to help them in their war against somebody whom they now have considered a rebel. Like that is, this whole campaign is largely a joke. And at the same time as Hugh O'Neill is with Henry Bagnall, he's also sending out orders to Hugh Maguire and to Red Hugh O'Donnell. In the case of Red Hugh O'Donnell, tell him to try and stay out of the fight as long as possible. And at that point, when the campaign is over, when Fermanagh is actually under Crown control and the town of Enniskillen is under Crown control, Hugh O'Neill then takes umbrage, saying he's not rewarded properly. And there's a sort of standoff. But at that point, the proxy war continues. And famously, Cormac McBarron attacks the supplies that the government are moving in to Fermanagh at the River Arnie, where at the ford of the Arnie, the so-called Battle of the Biscuits takes place, where the English lose their supplies. But intelligence reports show quite clearly afterwards that Hugh O'Neill actually met his brother afterwards and received his part of the booty. So consequently, he's really fighting against the state when he's pretending to be part of the state. And at this point, really, he's building up his forces also through the agency of Red Hugh O'Donnell and churchmen who have returned from Spain. He opens negotiations with Spain. Dr. James O'Healy, the Archbishop of Tuam, goes on an expedition to Spain to get support from Spain. So a proxy war has developed, but eventually in 1595, the government can't stand this shilly-shallying any longer. And because the point at that point is they had demanded that he go and get Red Hugh O'Donnell at that point, and that was just not on. So consequently, in 1595, O'Neill is proclaimed a traitor. And but the same year, he also gains complete control of Tyrone as the O'Neill, because Turlough Linnock dies. He goes to this inaugural stone as inaugurated as the O'Neill. And really, his success against Turlough was determined because the fact that Hugh O'Donnell had been sprung from prison, and that had really saw the end of Turlough Linnock in West Tyrone. So consequently, Hugh O'Neill now controls Ulster, but also, of course, by the time he becomes the O'Neill, he is also a proclaimed traitor. So he's now completely against the Crown. Hugh O'Neill had originally hoped that the Crown would let him be supreme in Ulster, hold the traditional O'Neill hegemony over Ulster. But it was plain, and that's why the war developed, that wasn't going to be allowed in the 1590s. So he wants to re-establish that by different means. And so what he tries to do is he tries to turn back the clock on the Tudor conquest. He encourages revolts amongst other Gaelic leaders in Connaught, in the Midlands of Ireland, in Laois and Offaly, where there were plantations, and then famously after the Battle of the Yellow Ford in Munster, against the plantation of Munster. So he seeks allies, and he wants to re-establish the traditional aristocracy in the provinces of Ireland against the Tudor conquest. So to do that, he requires a nationwide all-Ireland strategy. And that is what he pursues after he's proclaimed a traitor. And also, he turns to the Catholic cause and makes overtures to the towns in particular, hoping to win them over through Catholicism. So he has this faith in fatherland strategy, this twin strategy. But the problem is, the towns in particular aren't interested in an alliance with the Gaelic Irish. They're interested in Catholicism, but they're not interested in being led by the Gaelic Irish, and certainly not by O'Neill. So consequently, When the towns, Dublin and other towns, can't be won over by diplomacy and propaganda, O'Neill's only way of succeeding is to turn to Spain. He had made an alliance with Spain in 1596, but the Spaniards, of course, didn't arrive in Ireland with support until 1601, and by that stage it was in the furthest part south in Munster. It was too little, the military support they sent, and it was too late. And this is really because Ireland was very low down on Spain's priority list, and consequently, really, I suppose O'Neill had backed a horse which was, it was a winner, but it wasn't going to run in his behalf necessarily. So the defeat at Kinsale means that he has played all his cards.